of the EU, and having passionately campaigned to stay in the EU, it is very odd to find myself as Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU, and I can promise you nothing resembling this was on the list under my bed of things that I actually wanted to do with my life. But I like a challenge. As we face the situation that the result didn't go the way in which we wanted, we therefore are operating in an environment which was not the environment that I voted for or wished for. It's significant, I think, that we're having this discussion today because here we are at the end of what was supposed to be phase one of the negotiations, with Michel Barnier saying he cannot recommend that there's sufficient progress to get to phase two. And remember that only a year ago, the government was saying to us, David Davis was saying, Liam Fox was saying, there's going to be nothing easier than these negotiations. What are you also worried about? We were saying to the government, you should unilaterally guarantee the rights of EU citizens. The government said no. The government said no. And one of the reasons it said no is because these negotiations are going to be so easy, it'll be sorted out so quickly. And here we are, however many months after the referendum, with still no certainty for EU nationals. And I know from my advice surgeries, and you will know from your conversations, just how anxious people are on where we're at and where we're going. As you will have noticed, I hope, over the summer, I tried to develop Labour Party policy and thinking on Brexit because it was obvious to me that we would not reach agreement with our EU partners by March 2019. And that if we didn't have transition arrangements, we would go off a cliff with no deal. No deal is often talked of casually, as if it's just one of the options. It's not too bad. Boris Johnson says he's not overly bothered by it. But it is worth just reminding ourselves what no deal means. No deal means we have not agreed anything with our EU partners on trade. And that means huge tariffs in certain areas. It means customs duties, it means all the burdens that go with being outside of the single market and customs union with no deal, and it will have a huge economic impact. But that's not all. No deal means we have not agreed what the situation should be at the border in Northern Ireland. We have not agreed. No deal means we haven't reached an agreement. That means a hard border goes in. Of course also means that there are no rules for aviation. If we haven't reached a deal, then no plane can take off in the UK and land in Europe, and vice versa, because all of that is done according to an EU framework, which we will leave, and if we haven't agreed anything, we've put nothing in its place. No deal means that EU citizens, by March 2019, still have no certainty over their situation, and UK citizens have no certainty over their situation. No deal means we don't know what the limits are for fishing in the seas around our shores, because we've not come to an agreement. And in my old field of security and counter-terrorism, no deal means there is no basis agreed between us and the EU upon which we pass information to each other, share strategies to counter terrorism and serious crime, and we do that 24/7, by the way, all of the time, and that we have no shared arrangements for capturing people in any one country and moving them to another country, again, something goes on 24/7. So anyone who's casual about no deal has not thought through what no deal actually means. It is catastrophic. It cannot be allowed to happen. And people say, oh, you're just a sort of liver-lidded person, the EU will have you. Actually, no deal is simply unthinkable and unviable. And I have never understood. I mean, the government says, no, you don't understand how to negotiate. No deal is the cliff that you go over in March 2019 if you haven't reached an agreement. You are gently pushed over the cliff. The process pushes you over the cliff. I've never understood how threatening to jump is a good negotiating strategy. You won't catch us because we're over that cliff before we get to March. So you'll have to give us what we want. It's not going to happen. So I wanted to move our position on, and I said, one, we need transitional arrangements. Two, those transition arrangements should be on the same basic terms as now, which means on trade terms within the single market, within a customs union, so there is certainty for businesses and for communities, and it means accepting the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, so that there's a referee holding the ring for the transitional period. And that therefore a space is opened up for a more meaningful discussion about what the future should hold. And the development of our position over the summer was very warmly welcomed across businesses, across trade unions, and across many, many communities. It may or may not have influenced the Prime Minister in her Florence speech, but she did appear to me to edge a bit closer to acknowledging that we are not going to have got a deal by March 2019, and we're going to need some sort of extra period. She keeps still calling it an implementation stage, on the pretense that we will have reached the agreement, we're just implementing it. That is not the position we're going to be in. So when that speech was given, I thought, well, hang on, we, the official opposition, have now moved to this position of transiting on the same terms as now. The EU has always said that is a possibility, and now the Prime Minister's at least open to that. We may get to a stage where, by Christmas, that is the agreed position, and that would be a huge sigh of relief for many, many people. The reaction in Europe to the Prime Minister's speech was interesting. It was reasonably warm. I'm out in Brussels a lot talking to our EU partners and to some of the negotiating team. They were warm to what was said, but, and this was really important, they said, we're going to wait a week or two before we formally respond, because we need to know whether this is going to be the Cabinet's view and whether the Prime Minister will hold it at a party conference. Now, that's really shocking. I'll tell you why it's shocking. Because that means the Prime Minister has lost such authority that when she says something about what the UK is going to do, it isn't taken as what the UK will do until others have heard what the Cabinet are going to do. They vandalised that progress, and they did it deliberately. Within 2 weeks, you had at least 5 Cabinet members saying different things, inconsistent with the Florence Agreement, to a point now, I was back in Brussels the other day, where our EU partners are back despairing about where we're really at. So it comes, in a sense, as no surprise that we've reached the position today where insufficient progress has been made. And as you will know as well as I do, that means if the Council next week says there's not sufficient progress, it all goes off for another 2 months until December, which means that we can't get on to the next stage, even on a best case scenario, until January. Because of the ratification process for Article 50, the deal has to be done by about October, November. That means the pressure on the sort of 9 or 10 months next year is intense. And I'm really worried that the risk of no deal is going up and not down.
Yes.
I actually felt at the election that that no deal, which had been much talked up before the election, was then off the table and people were a bit more grown up. Because before the election, anybody who said, hang on, have you risk assessed what you're doing? Hang on, is this the right thing to do? Was shot down as a Brexit denier. And that was either in business or in Parliament. After the election, a space, I think, opened up for a more sensible discussion about what the future holds. Now, and I thought no deal was gone as a result of that. Now it's back on the agenda. And so one of the things that we, the Labour Party, have to do, having tried to seize the initiative over the summer on transitional measures, is I think to step up again over the next few weeks to fight using the withdrawal bill to make sure that no deal is not the end result, because no deal is catastrophic for our country.
Yeah.
Once you're at the bottom of the cliff, it is so difficult to get back into a sensible relationship with the EU. What I hope will happen is that we will remind ourselves of our values and principles as we go through this process. That we should not read the EU referendum as a prohibition on a close future relationship with the EU. I don't think we can read it in that extreme way. I don't think we can read it in the extreme way that the Prime Minister set out in her speech at Party Conference last year. We need to have a future relationship with the EU which is built on those principles of collaboration and cooperation, so that we and the next generation and the generation after that can actually enjoy that collaborative relationship with the EU that we have all enjoyed. It's a long road, it's a difficult road, and all parties are finding their way through it. But I'm convinced that if we stick to our principles, stick to our values, we will find a way through this. But we must remind ourselves why we voted in the way we did, and we must remind ourselves why Leave voters or Leave advocates advocated Leave. Those, certainly in the Tory party who advocated Leave, did so because their world vision is very different to mine. They wanted to leave the EU, not actually because they hate the EU or EU countries, but because they saw in the EU a block to their vision of Britain, which is as a deregulated, low-tax, free trade country, trading across the world, but without the baggage of basic rights, basic standards. And so stripping away those rights is part of a world vision for those that most advocated Leave. And so through all this, we have to cling to what we believe in the Labour Party to achieve the end we need to achieve. I'll end with this, because I do think that the election this year was a game changer. I think before that election, most people probably thought that the best the Labour Party could do was try in some way to influence what was going on, but they didn't envisage the influence would be particularly great, and they certainly didn't envisage that Labour might take over the negotiations. The general election has changed the state of affairs. We are differently received every time we're in Brussels and in other EU countries. We are much more able to influence what's going on. We will see a whole series of challenges to the government in the withdrawal bill this autumn. You will have noticed the withdrawal bill, which was supposed to be starting its committee stage amendments next week, is not now. So the government has pulled the timetable. I mean, I think that's because they've realised that they cannot withstand the challenge. They're going to have to rewrite parts of the withdrawal bill. And if we go on to transition arrangements for between 2 and 4 years, that means the next general election may come before the negotiations are finished. And if, as I hope, the Labour Party wins that next election, that means that we can take over the negotiations. And I've already said that if I'm still in post and we do win, the first thing I'll do is go to Brussels and say we want to reset the negotiating objectives and go back to a much more positive, progressive approach. Thank you very much. I'm sure the questions and answers a bit you really want to get questions and answers a bit you really want to get.
But isn't Labour's power to oppose on the matter rather neutered by the support you officially gave for the Article 50 trigger without clear evidence that the government had a plan?
No, I don't accept that. Firstly, I do criticise the government because having triggered Article 50 and knowing there was a 2-year period, to then, in a calculated way, call an election, and the purpose of which was to crush any opposition to their plans and thus waste 3 months, was reckless. I mean, here we are 7 months down the line since Article 50 was triggered. We haven't made progress. 3 of the 7 months was wasted with a general election that was unnecessary. And the only reason for the election was to try and stop dissent, to crush the saboteurs, to stop people challenging the government. So I do criticise them for that. I mean, on the triggering Article 50, I mean, let me just run through that, since it's going to come up, no doubt, here time and time again. I went around the country imploring people to vote Remain. I never, ever said to people, it doesn't matter, you're expressing an opinion, it's a bit of an opinion poll, tell us what you think. I actually said, go from your house and vote, because it really matters. It really matters. Things are going to change if you don't do it. And everybody I know who was campaigning for Remain, everybody I know was sending the same message. And everybody on the other side was sending the same message. Nobody, and I was with hundreds and thousands of people in the campaign, nobody ever said to anybody, this is just advice, ever. It was also the wrong thing to do, because we have to understand why people voted to leave. And I'm not in the camp that belittles people who voted to leave. Some people are. They say, well, they didn't understand, they sold lies. We clever people understood the lies, but they didn't. Actually, having spoken to many people who voted leave, having spoken to many MPs who are in leave areas, people voted to leave because they genuinely thought it was the right thing for them, their family and their communities, for a whole variety of reasons. And we have to respect that and not belittle people because of the way they voted. And we will never achieve anything if we go down that route. I've tried to reflect on why did people vote to leave, and asked myself why that phrase, take back control, was so powerful. I hate that phrase. I hated that phrase. But I'm not going to stand and pretend it wasn't. It was a Heineken phrase.
Yes,
it got into people because it asked them the question, do you think you've got enough control and influence over your life? Are things working under this political and economic model for you? To which many people said, no, they're not. And I think if you look at across the board, many people may have said that because their wages have been stagnant for many years and you don't have control over your life if your wages are stagnant. If your employment is more frigid than it was. If you live in the regions, looking down on London, for better or for worse, right or wrong, many people feel all the money and the influence and the infrastructure in London, and I don't have enough of that control and influence around me. People, I think, looked at politicians and said, I don't much like the look of him or her, they're all in it for what they can get out of it. Massive distrust in politics. I don't feel I've got control and influence because the person I vote for isn't a person that I've got any faith in. I think people in communities that were changing very quickly said, I don't have sufficient control, particularly where there was immigration. I went to Oldham a number of times in the last few years, and in Oldham, they have rammed in poor asylum seekers into cheap accommodation because it's cheap. In one ward in Oldham, 700 asylum seekers have been put into accommodation there because it's cheap. And that's awful for the asylum seekers. It's also awful for everyone else living there because it's created such tension. And none of the local community like it, nor do they feel that they've consented to it. So when they're asked the question, do you think you've got enough control and influence over their life, their answer is no. And unless we understand that, simply saying, well, we don't like the result, we're sort of rubbing it out, and we don't address deeply why people voted in that way, then I don't think we're being honest with ourselves. I accept that a lot of that's got nothing to do with the EU. That's to do with years of political failure by a number of different political parties. And it's a fundamental cry for political change. But ignoring that and walking past an outcry, which was the 23rd of June, is not forgivable if you're in politics to change things. I mean, whilst I'm on this, I do need to address the 48% because I think that's also really important. Then I'll come back to Article 50. Yeah. Of the 48%, my strong feeling is that there is a very high level of anxiety that 48% are being treated as if they had voted away their own future. In other words, you voted the wrong way on the 23rd of June, therefore what you care about doesn't matter anymore, and it doesn't matter for a generation. We don't need to build a country that accommodates you anymore. And that is fundamentally wrong. So I felt that we, the Labour Party, had to stand up to the challenge of actually representing both the 52% and the 48%. And that meant respecting the outcome of the referendum and fighting for a collaborative, progressive relationship with the EU going forward that's built on the values that I care about and many other people who voted to remain care about. And I did not think, fundamentally, that politicians should treat the 23rd of June as the new political divide, where political parties said, I'll go with one side or the other, without regard to the other side, and that we would use all of our energies looking back, trying to rub out what had happened instead of walking towards a challenge we didn't want to address. And if you accept the referendum result, and I do, then you cannot stand in the way of Article 50 being triggered, which means the process must be allowed to start. Because you'd be better off being honest and say, I don't accept the result. If you don't accept the result, then I accept, don't allow Article 50 to be triggered. But you can't say on the one hand, I accept the result, but I won't let the Prime Minister start the process. That is actually intellectually dishonest. So I more respect people who say, I don't accept the result, full stop, never will. What I don't particularly like is people say, I accept the result, but I don't think the process should be allowed to start. And that just doesn't make sense. That's why we voted for Article 50 to be triggered. That's the only vote we've had. This Prime Minister has not allowed any vote in Parliament on any Brexit issue apart from that. We've never voted on Lancaster House, we've never voted on the White Paper, never voted on EU citizens' rights in any meaningful way, etc., etc. But walking past the challenge and pretending to accept the result, but not, in fact, to follow through the logical conclusion of that, I think is wrong in principle. And I'm not prepared to be part of a party which is incapable of speaking to and for both sides of that divide. I think it's a huge mistake for any political party. Long answer, but I know it's something very close to the hearts of probably almost everybody in this room.
Which is then, what does that mean for the vote in Parliament if and when it comes? Because I know Labour has said we'll go for a meaningful vote. What does a meaningful vote mean?
Yeah, okay. Well, let me take both of those. The mantra is no deal's better than a bad deal. If you don't understand that, you know good negotiating. No deal's better than a bad deal. No deal, as I said, means a terrible trade situation, terrible customs situation, a hard border in Northern Ireland, no planes, no security measures that have been agreed, no agreement on fishing, no agreement on agriculture. I want someone to describe this bad deal to me that is worse than that, because nobody's managed to do it yet. What is this mythical bad deal that's worse than a hard border in Northern Ireland? What's this mythical bad deal that's worse than not being able to exchange terrorist information with our EU allies?
It's not so much what the bad deal is, it's giving up on helping assess what reality actually is best for us and still fighting, possibly, to stay in the EU.
Well, that's a different question. That's a different question. But the battle we're having with the government is between being sensible and grown up and accepting no deal is not viable and must be avoided, and those that stand up in Parliament and say, no, you don't understand negotiation, it is better to go off the cliff, and at least we should threaten to go off the cliff, because otherwise nobody will take us seriously. And that's why my challenge to those that say no deal's better than a bad deal is just write on one page of A4 what this mythical bad deal is that's actually worse than the consequences of no deal, because at the moment I'm struggling to see what that would actually look like. On the vote, I mean, firstly, I think it's very important we do have a vote. The European Parliament will have a vote on the Article 50 deal, and the idea that we in the House of Commons will simply watch the European Parliament vote on our deal and not have a vote ourselves is unthinkable. It is a bit of a rock and a hard place because the deal will come at the end of the negotiations, and if there is a deal, if it's voted down, then you end up with no deal. And that's the way the Prime Minister wants to present it to us. That's why during the passage of the Article 50 bill, I was very keen to extract from the Prime Minister an assurance that we would vote before the European Parliament. Now, and we've just about got it. And the purpose of that is that we would vote in about October of this year, which still leaves quite a chunk of Article 50 left before the deadline comes down. Because the nearer it is to the deadline, the less meaningful the vote can be. Yeah. But it is a very important vote. If the government presents no deal, we will vote it down. And I think that if the government presents a package which doesn't have the confidence of the House of Commons, that provokes quite an important constitutional crisis for the government, which we'll have to address when we get there. Now, I hope that we don't get to that position, because I hope that what we will be voting on in the autumn is an Article 50 agreement that says we've reached agreement on EU nationals and UK nationals in Europe. We've reached agreement on the money. We've reached agreement on Northern Ireland, and we've also reached an agreement that we will transit on the same basic terms as now. If that's the package put before Parliament, well, that's something which we would seriously consider. But less than that, and we set out some red lines, 6 red line tests earlier in the year, is something which we will vote against. But I think to have that grip is really important in the system.
You vote against if there's no deal?
If there's no deal, we'll vote against a no deal. I mean, if there's no deal, I think it won't be just us. I think some Tory MPs would really struggle to vote for it, and therefore I think no deal probably means the government falls, and rightly so.
If you won an election and went to Brussels and said we want to reset the negotiations, what is that vision? Because at the moment, it feels that your party is great at setting out great visions on what it would do in power, and you have a lot of enthusiastic base, but you could operate as a pole to pull attention away from the Conservative Party and their dysfunction by offering an alternative vision of saying, if we get to reset the negotiations, this is what we're going to aim for. Because I am not clear right now, if you went to Brussels and reset negotiations, what sort of deal would you be arguing?
Because we've said we transit for as short or as long as necessary, and I've always said that's about 2 to 4 years. and we do it within the single market in a customs union, accepting the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and that includes free movement and abiding by the rules. You can't get a clearer exposition of the situation than that. You may agree with it, you may disagree with it, but it is no longer a valid criticism to say it's not clear. It's crystal clear. So the Labour Party from this summer through till 2021, 22, 23 is absolutely crystal clear about the position, and we've led the way on it. We've led the way on it, and others are following, and we've discussed it across Europe, and you can see what the government is doing. So lack of clarity about that is not fair. The next question is, well, why can't you be equally clear about what the position in 22, 23, 24 is? Have absolute clarity, tell us exactly what it is and what the position will be. Let's just think about that. That's 4 to 6 years worth of negotiation away. What sensible party would say this is the only outcome we will ever countenance after 4 to 6 years of negotiation? Of course there has to be a greater degree of flexibility there. There's got to be negotiation. We've got to see what's happening in Europe. Europe itself has changed enormously. Cast your mind back to a year ago. In the tail end of 2016 going into 2017, Europe itself seemed to be lacking in confidence, and there was a crisis as to whether the EU project would survive. And people were keeping a very close eye on the polls in France, and were thinking that if the right wing in France was to win the election, which looked at one stage that it might happen, the presidency, then the European project was over. And Juncker himself put a white paper to the Commission in January saying there are 6 possible versions of Europe going forward. Now fast forward, and Europe's in a much more confident place with the election of Macron. Germany's not quite so straightforward. But that 4 to 6 years is not only an important time for politics here, it's also an important time for politics in Europe. And therefore saying broadly what we want to hope to achieve, but not saying the only model in 6 years I would countenance is X, is actually quite a sensible way to do negotiations. As for what is the sort of vision of that, we have set out in our manifesto, I set out over the summer, I repeated in my conference speech, that we want an approach that puts the economy first and jobs first. And that's important, that's not just mantra, because the Prime Minister has put immigration first. That's really unusual for a Prime Minister. Most Prime Ministers put in their sort of big ticket items, they go for security of the nation first. That's always the sort of number 1 item, keep people safe, don't go to war, fight terrorism. It's quite an important big ticket number 1 item. The next one is the economy, and after that you have other priorities. Immigration is one of them. This Prime Minister's flipped that to put immigration above the economy. That's a very odd thing to do. I can't think of any Prime Minister who's ever done that before. So we've got our priorities right. We've said that we want a progressive partnership with the EU built on collaboration and cooperation, not just in trade but in all the other fields. And I, from my point of view, from my values, I don't care what label you put on this partnership. I don't care whether you call it this version of the single market, that version of customs union. If we're in a progressive partnership with Europe based on collaboration and cooperation, that's what I was voting for in June of last year. It's what I want for the future for my children. I've got a 6-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy. We've also said that we recognise the benefits of the single market and customs union. We want to retain them. We've also said we understand the price of retaining them. Because although there's a lot of discussion about freedom of movement, in my discussions in Europe, the discussions are about something much more basic and important. The basic deal is you get an amazing access to a very big market for goods and services on very good terms. The price for that is that you are on a level playing field. And that level playing field is that there are standards at work which in your country you will not go below. There are environmental standards that you'll adhere to. There are consumer protection standards that you will abide by. And you mustn't break those standards and those rules, because otherwise you will unfairly compete with another company or business in another country that is operating within the same market. That's the deal. For the Labour Party, we do not want to deregulate. There's a fundamental dividing point between us and the Tories. Those that advocated out wanted to deregulate. They can't live with the social and political model. We can. So we're having a very different discussion with Europe. And I am, with the right tone and approach, the right objectives, I'm convinced that we can, if we were negotiating, we would make real progress down that road. Can I tell you whether it'll be technically the Norway model or this model or that model? No, I'm not going to. It's a mistake. At the end, I don't care what badge is put on it, as long as it delivers a collaborative, cooperative partnership, progressive partnership with the EU. And whether you call it this version of single market or that version, or customs union or not, it doesn't matter. Does it deliver what we're trying to achieve? And so, the call for us to spell out in black and white the only version in 6 or however many years that we would ever countenance is actually, I think, a slightly unreal approach to international politics and negotiation against a moving and different background.
Hi.
Hi.
I'll say straight away, I'm French, and I've got a question about EU nationals. Basically, I understand one of the stumbling blocks is the fact that the EU want EU nationals to be under the supervision of the European Court, because we don't trust the Home Office. We trust the UK Bush, but we don't trust the Home Office. How do you see that panning out?
Well, I mean, that's a really, really good question, because that is the devil in the phase 1 discussion, exactly. And it will bedevil everything else. The most significant thing the Prime Minister said, for the wrong reasons, a year ago in her conference speech, is that she wouldn't countenance any role for an international court and will have nothing to do with the ECJ. The only courts that will have any power will be our courts in the UK. And she is there. In that, I mean, when I went to Brussels the week after that, that was the thing that caught everybody's eye. What she said about freedom of movement and all the rest of it, we're better off without you, that was all rhetoric. But that point about the court was the one everybody was talking about. Because there's a basic inconsistency. You cannot have a close, special, comprehensive agreement with the EU and not have institutions. The two go together. And that's the same, that's not just an EU thing, that's the same for any trade agreement across the world. The Canada EU trade agreement that's just been agreed has a court. It started life without a court. It started life with one of these investor dispute panels where you get private arbitrators to decide, and because they were getting closer to a more comprehensive trade agreement, they had to convert that into a court, because you need courts if you're going to have rules, and you need an umpire if you're going to have rules. And by the way, I think courts are a good thing. I like the idea of independent judges deciding independently according to the rule of law. We've been developing this idea for about 1,000 years, and we've worked it up quite well. And my preference is for courts rather than private panels where the squabbling sides appoint a panel member. So there's that basic inconsistency. And with EU citizens, the point that matters is, if we reach an agreement for EU citizens, and I hope we do, that needs to hold for the lifetime of those that are subject to it. It's no good people in this country being told, right, we've got a deal, these are your rights, and then in 5 years' time that all changes and they can't do anything about it. Because people are making life decisions about themselves and about their children. So you can understand. And the EU's point is, if you're going to do that, we need a referee, and the referee's got to be a body that sits outside of any one country. I mean, the Prime Minister says, look, our Supreme Court will do it. I mean, they're really good judges, and they're great, and they are. They're fantastic judges, but they're our judges, and they apply our law. And we wouldn't sign up to a scheme where French judges were the arbiters of rights of people in this country. So we need a court. We need a role, I think, for the European Court, but certainly a court for EU citizens. And we need it if we're going to have a sensible and close relationship going forward. And the sooner the Prime Minister rubs out that dogmatic ideological red line, the better, because we will not be able to achieve what we need to achieve if we hold on to this notion that we're not going to have shared institutions. Shared institutions means an arm's length, and pretty well torn away from the EU relationship for the future.
Would you also, what's the Labour Party policy on pushing for a second referendum, not a rerun referendum, but a second referendum on the deal itself, and not just comments having posted?
Yeah. No, well, I understand why people advocate a second referendum. The most powerful argument that I've heard is that whilst in the referendum campaign in was pretty clearly defined, out wasn't. And on the blank piece of paper that represented out, people drew all sorts of unbelievable things. And there ought, in fairness, to be a point at which in can truly be compared with out. And people can make, as it were, a more informed choice. And so I understand that argument. But when you actually hold it up to the light, it's very difficult to see how that actually works for a number of reasons. The first is, Article 50 having been triggered, we are leaving the EU in March 2019. After March 2019, in is no longer an option. And therefore, if there's to be a second referendum where there is an in option or a staying in option, it's got to be before March 2019. But when's that going to be? It takes about a year for legislation to come through the system for a referendum. You can't just hold a referendum. You'll have legislation, you've got to put the Electoral Commission in charge, they've got to determine who the lead candidates, their teams are, they've got to decide a date, they've got to decide PERDA, they've got to avoid all the other dates for elections, etc., etc. So if there was to be a second referendum, before March 2019, the legislation for that would have to be beginning its journey in Parliament now, and it would have to succeed. That's not going to happen. And it's not fair to those that are anxious about Remain to pretend that it can happen. It's not fair. And even if it did, what would you be choosing between? Let's say the government has done what I hope it will do, and negotiated transitional arrangements. Who proposes putting to the electorate in and transitional arrangements and asking for a sensible result? It's not. You know, it seems to me that's an unreal proposition. After that, we're out. So if you have a referendum after that, the question is not do you want to stay in or leave, it's do you want to leave or go back in? Going back in means that all the opt-outs go. So going back in, as you know, if you proceed to the EU now, it's on the basis you take the euro, you take Schengen, and all of the opt-outs that we have negotiated will be off the table. That's a very different proposition to the proposition we're in now. So, you know, I've always, and I know there are Dems in the room, I can see some of them, but my challenge is identify for me how you propose this happening. And if you can't do that, don't pretend it can happen. Because it's not, when people are anxious, the last thing you should do is to pretend there's an easy answer that isn't going to happen. Now, I mean, let me just caveat that, because, you know, we're looking at what might happen. I've only been in this, I've been an MP for 2 years, it seems a lot longer than that. I became an MP in 2015. And so much has changed in that 2 years, most of which I didn't predict. Most of the judgment calls I made about what would happen were wrong. I thought we would win the referendum, we didn't. I thought that Donald Trump wouldn't become President of America. I thought that the Prime Minister wouldn't call an election after she'd triggered Article 50 because it'd be such a stupid thing to do, given the clock was ticking. And I thought that if she did trigger it, she'd probably win the election. So my predictions about the future are pretty useless. And so who knows what's going to happen in the 2020s. But there was, I just need to share this with you and explain this to you, because there is also a psychological question that political parties have to ask themselves, and that we have to ask ourselves, which is, if you're in a circumstance you don't want to be in, do you stand up and face the challenge in front of you, or do you try to rub out yesterday? And it's a profound thing. And I thought about this as a dad. This is personally, that's on the 24th of June, I was with my young kids. And my thought was, what sort of world are they going to grow up in? I wasn't thinking about the single market, customs union, and technical stuff. I just thought, I don't want this world to be an inward-looking, intolerant country where people aren't welcome, we don't want to collaborate, we don't want to be on the sort of international stage. And we all had to make a decision. Do we walk towards the challenge in front of us and try to shape and influence what the future actually will be, or do we just look backwards and try and rub out? And if all you do is rub out yesterday, if that's all you can do, you have no answer to the question. What are you actually going to do if that doesn't work? And going around the country, I felt, and this is partly political, but just forgive me, and I know it's not fair on the Dems who are not here at the mic, but I felt that the half proposition of getting rid of what had happened without the full proposition of what will you do if that doesn't work wasn't something people wanted to hear. People wanted to have a reassurance that you could go to Brussels and negotiate something for the future. And therefore, I mean, it's a long answer. And I genuinely understand the argument about a second referendum, and I know what lies behind it, and I understand that. But personally, I think just to focus on rubbing out yesterday and not facing tomorrow. I mean, what am I supposed to say to my kids if that's what I did, it didn't work, and in the meantime, the Tories got away with the most brutal, extreme version of their future? Not good enough. It is a complete power grab, and fundamentally sidelines the role of Parliament, because what the government has said is we don't quite know how the negotiations are going to go, therefore we want a giant enabling bill that allows us to do what's necessary at the relevant time, and you're going to have to just give us the power and trust us to do it. To which we said no, that's why we voted against it at second reading. That was a very powerful way of saying no. We've got there are 200 amendments down at the moment, and there is going to be a real fight this autumn on that question of where power actually resides, because this Prime Minister and this government have been trying to push power away from Parliament at every twist and turn, and we're going to try and wrestle it back. Importantly, on the question of transitional measures, because at the moment the bill extinguishes the role of the European Court of Justice. Now, if you do that, you take away the ability to have sensible transition arrangements. So who controls that really matters. Henry VIII is a great phrase, but actually that really matters, because if that is in the control of the executive, we have no say over transitional matters, and for me, transitional arrangements are the most important issue to fight over at the moment.
Keir, thank you so much for coming. On behalf of all of us, this has already been a very useful evening, and there are more questions to come, but I'm going to ask you a really nasty one.
She said sweet.
What a sweet pell.
Well, which is, I think everyone in the room agrees that it would be a complete and utter disaster for us to crash out of the negotiations. But I think also the events of the last few days suggest that that may be where we're heading. If we are, what's Labour going to do?
Well, I mean, the first thing we need to do is to absolutely make the argument that no deal is not viable. And I don't think that argument's been strongly enough made. At the moment, there's a sort of casualisation of it, where people think, well, it's not ideal, but it's not that bad. I didn't want this for Christmas, but it's going to be quite useful. People think it's the status quo. So I think the first thing Labour has to do is to spell out every opportunity we can what it actually means. And most people think, oh, it just means a bit of change on the old trade agreements, some tariffs. Actually, it's got very, very, very serious implications.
Agreed.
Second thing we need to do is to use the period between now and Christmas to make sure that transitional arrangements are real, and that the prospect of them goes up and not down. And that's why we are making the arguments, putting the amendments forward in Parliament. That's why I am in Brussels talking to our EU partners, making the argument that it is not in the interest of the EU to have no deal, just as it's not in our interest to have a no deal, because we're very good at saying what we want the UK to have. We're not very good at understanding what's on the other side of the table. And having discussions with our partner countries across the EU, which is what I'm trying to do, so that nobody thinks it's a good idea, is intended to ensure that it becomes less likely, not more likely. And at the end of the day, as I say, if it comes to a vote in Parliament, we will not vote for a no deal. We will vote it down. Now, obviously, at that stage, it's pretty catastrophic, but I wouldn't think a government would survive a no deal vote in Parliament, and that their government would then fall. But I completely agree with you that it's the casual talk of no deal, the implication that it's perfectly, Boris Johnson, I'm perfectly all right with no deal. I'm sure he is. But the rest of us aren't, and it will be other people that will pay the price. I am proud of the fact that over the summer, quietly and behind the scenes, our party developed our policy and stands on a firm platform now in relation to transitional measures, which is the most important issue of the day. and has spelt out at least the aspiration and what we're trying to achieve for the final. And we've done it collectively. So what I set out in the Observer in August is official party policy, signed off by me, signed off by Jeremy Corbyn, signed off by the Shadow Cabinet. And that was deliberate. I could have just done an article in my name and somebody else would do an article in their name, but I wanted a united Labour Party position. The Shadow Cabinet wants a united Labour Party position, and that's our position. And you know, we're always challenged whenever we're on the media, say, well, X said this, Y said the other, Z said the other. But actually, that is the position of the Labour Party, and it's a strong platform on which we stand, and it's a united position of the Labour Party, and actually been welcomed across the Labour Party. I mean, of course, there are differences in views in the Labour Party. It's not sensible for me to stand here and say otherwise, because people have different strongly held views about Europe, as they do in the Conservative Party. But actually having arrived at that united position is I think, very, very important for our position. And I think most party members and voters were relieved that we got to that place over the summer, and think that that has begun to make a real difference to the discussions that are actually being had.
What do you think you would be saying to businesses, to industry, to try to stem the hemorrhage of companies and business and jobs out of the country while this is going on?
Well, the most important period is right now, and I'm talking to businesses all of the time. I've talked to hundreds of businesses across the country, and to representatives of businesses. So I talked to Caroline Fairbairn at the CBI a lot, and to other representatives of different sectors of businesses, and I think it's really important that we continue to do so. And they are engaging very, very heavily with me and with the Labour Party, and this is a good thing. The critical period is now, because they are saying loud and clear that they are having to plan for March 2019 now, and that until they know there's going to be a deal and transitional arrangements, they're going to have to plan for no deal. And whereas this was a sort of more theoretical question 6 months ago, it's now a real question. And inevitably what that means is that instead of saying we might have to move people, we might have to operate from somewhere else, now they're going through the process of saying, what licenses do we need to apply for in another country? What premises might we need? What members of staff, or what roles might we have to move? And the reason I moved on transitional measures over the summer, and I'm pressing it so hard now, is my strong impression for businesses is they need the answer to that question before Christmas, and if not before Christmas, by early next year, because the validity and the use of transitional measures gets less as each month goes by. It's actually a point that Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, made yesterday, but it's a good point, which is the utility of transitional measures goes down the more time that passes. So at the moment we are having a very, very intense discussion with business. They are very, very supportive of the Labour Party position on transitional measures, very, very supportive, because that's what they want as the outcome. And I want to continue with those discussions. My worry is not so much what happens in the transitional measures, it's that there will be a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is once businesses have taken a certain number of measures, they'll get so far down the line that it won't be worth them backing up, and that therefore, even if there are transitional measures late in the day, they won't serve their purpose. And so, for businesses, Caroline Fairbairn has described this. She said that in the immediate aftermath of the referendum, businesses were sort of shell-shocked and didn't quite know what to make of it. Then, in the autumn of last year, as businesses do, they were sort of adapting and saying, well, we'll just have to get on with the job. But she now describes the level of anxiety as very high, as they are now thinking, what am I practically going to have to do to prepare for no deal? And that's why getting no deal off the table, getting transitional arrangements on the table, and doing it in the immediate future is critically important. And we're fundamentally engaged with that. And I can assure you, I'm having meetings with businesses and trade unions all the time. And if you, Rolls-Royce or something like that would be an example where you can have a discussion with the management of a business, a big business, about what they want for the next 6 months. You can have a discussion with Unite the Union about what they want, and at the moment the two are exactly the same about preserving British businesses and the economy. And that's I mean, my challenge to people like Boris Johnson, who claims, who says I'm casual about no deal, is which business are you actually talking to? No business has come to me in 12 or more months, in hundreds of meetings with thousands of businesses, and said we're casual about no deal.
Do you not feel that the EU is in some way contributing to what is already a difficult situation by the mandate it's given Barnier on the sequencing? Would you not empathize a little bit with Davis's point that that those talks should be widened up, should be broadened?
What Michel Barnier said is, whilst we've been talking about EU citizens and Northern Ireland, we haven't even been talking about the money because we're so deadlocked. That's one thing to say we're having a good old quarrel about the money, but to say we're not even talking about it is really serious. And so they need to get around the table and talk. I am critical of the government. They wasted time since the triggering of Article 50 with a general election they didn't need to hold. They've got red lines that the Prime Minister's put down which made progress really difficult, and they've got a divided cabinet, which means that they haven't got the authority they need to advance the talks, and that's not by accident, that's by design of some of those talks. So I am highly critical. On the other hand, I have said today, and I've said to David Davis across the House, that I am sympathetic to his argument that to compartmentalise the issues that we're dealing with now and those that come later is a bit unreal. And when he says there's only so far you can get with Northern Ireland in phase one, he's right about that. And so one of the things I said on the media today is that both sides need to show much greater flexibility, and I hope that the EU finds a way to enable some of the second phase issues, particularly transition arrangements, to be discussed before Christmas. Actually, I mean, I was accused on the radio of being too reasonable, but I do understand some of the frustration that David Davis has about the sequencing, and actually it would be better if there was more flexibility on both sides. So I do accept that. I mean, it is extraordinary how two people emerge from the same set of talks and give such a different readout, but we kind of got used to that now. I was encouraged when Michel Barnier said that there was a basis for hoping that within the next 2 months there would be decisive progress. I'd like to see that speeded up, so it's not in the next 2 months, but it's in the next 2 weeks. Because if we go past the year end without getting to the next stage, the space for what has to happen next is really, really tight. But I hope I haven't been out just saying it's all the government's fault, although a lot of it is the government's fault. There needs to be actually flexibility on both sides. Thank you very much.
Thank you.